Rusty Quill presents the Magnus Archives. Episode 8, Burned Out.
Statement of Ivo Lensick regarding his experiences during construction of a house on Hilltop Road, Oxford. Original statement given March 13th, 2007. Audio recording by Jonathan Sims, head archivist of the Magnus Institute, London. Statement begins. I've worked in construction for almost 20 years now, mostly in and around the Oxford area. When my father passed away in 1996, I took over his contracting business and have been working steadily ever since. I can do most anything I'm called on for, but generally specialize in new builds, plumbing and wiring work specifically. And I've got something of a reputation for being available at short notice, so it's not unusual for me to be called in partway through a build to do some work. When I got the job working on a house down Hilltop Road in mid-November, nothing about the situation seemed strange to me. The guy they had doing the wiring had been called for jury duty and they'd lost him for a couple of weeks, so they asked me to step in. I was on another job during the day, but my fiancée Sam was at a conference in Hamburg for a while, and we were saving up for the wedding, so I figured I could do it in the evenings. Now, Hilltop Road is quite a secluded street around the Cowley area. There aren't many student houses on it, so it's actually quite a peaceful place, especially after all the kids living there have gone to bed. The house itself had only recently been started, as some dispute over ownership had kept the land locked for years, and when I turned up it was still mostly empty. It had 2 floors, with a loft that was going to be another bedroom to match the rest of the road. The doors had been fitted, although the locks had not, but the empty spaces where the windows were due to be still stood vacant, letting in the chill. That side of the road backed onto South Park, with fences marking the bottom of each garden. The garden of this particular house was mostly full of building materials and debris, but I remember that standing over it all was a tree. It was very large and very dead, and not to put too fine a point on it, the thing creeped me right the hell out. It seemed to cast odd shadows, which were dark and clear on even most overcast of days. But it wasn't the tree that started it, though. No, that happened my 3rd night on the job. It must have been 8 or 9 in the evening, as it had been dark for a couple of hours. I was working on the ground floor wiring when I heard a knock at the front door. At first I thought it must have been one of the other builders who had forgotten something, but then I realized that there was no lock on the door. Any of the others would have known that and just come right in. I began to feel slightly uneasy when the knock came again. Over the years I've had a few altercations with punks that wanted to cause trouble on my site, so I picked up a hammer as I approached. I did my best to hold it casually, as though I'd just been using it. I opened the door to see an unassuming man in a tan coat. He was quite young, white, maybe mid-20s, clean-shaven with shaggy chestnut-brown hair. His coat was quite an old cut. It seemed to me he looked like something out of an old Polaroid. He said his name was Raymond Fielding, and that he owned the house. As he spoke, I felt my grip on the hammer tightening, although I have no idea why. I asked him if he had any ID or documents, and he handed over to me what seemed, as far as I could tell, to be the deed to the house, as well as the land beneath, and did indeed list a man named Raymond Fielding as the owner. So I let him in. I apologized for the draft, and said the window panes were being put in over the next few days, but until then it was going to be cold. He didn't respond, just walked over to the empty frame of the back window and stared out into the garden. I tried to get on with my work, keeping one eye on this stranger. Nothing about the situation felt quite right, but he didn't seem to be doing anything suspicious, just standing there, looking into the garden. So I returned my concentration to the wiring. After a minute or two, I became conscious of a sharp, unpleasant smell. I thought maybe I'd wired something up wrong, but no, it smelled like burning human hair. I looked over to where Raymond had been standing, but he was gone. Where he had been, there was just a patch of scorched wooden floor, still apparently smouldering and giving off that dreadful stink. I ran to get the fire extinguisher from an adjoining room. I was gone only a few seconds, but when I returned, the smell was gone. And there was no longer any smoke or fire, just the burn mark on the wooden floor in front of that window. Touching it, I found that it was just as cold as the rest of the floor. I started to clean and found that the wood below appeared to be undamaged, with just a coating of soot and ashes on top. I had to look around for this Raymond Fielding, but if he was ever truly there, then he was gone now. It was only when I finished cleaning up the mark that the true strangeness of the situation began to sink in, and I started to panic. I should probably explain my fear a bit, as it wasn't because of ghosts or phantom smells or anything like that. You see, there is quite a significant history of schizophrenia among the men in my family. My father had it, as did my great-uncle, and in both of their cases it led to suicide. I didn't know much about my great-uncle, but I had seen my father's decline firsthand. It had started shortly after his divorce from my mother, although thinking about it, it was perhaps the early stages that had exacerbated the problems in their marriage. Regardless, he began to spend a lot of time locked in his study doing his work. I was maybe 24 or 25 at the time, and still living at home. I was working with my dad, doing much the same job as I do now, and it was at this point I had to take on more and more of the actual running of the business, since my father was beginning to prioritize his work over his actual job. His work turned out to be fractals. He became obsessed with them, seemed to spend all his time drawing them, staring at them, measuring the patterns they created. He would talk to me for hours about the maths behind them, and tell me that he was on the verge of a great truth. He was going to shake mathematics to its foundations once he figured out this truth hidden in those cascading fractal patterns. One day, I returned home to find my father staring through the blinds in terror. He claimed that someone was following him, told me that they were planning to stop his work. I asked him who it was, but he shook his head violently and said I'd know him when I saw him, because all the bones are in his hands. I tried to get him help, of course I did, but he refused to take any medication, as he said it interfered with his work. And he wasn't dangerous, so I couldn't have him committed. I knew it was only a matter of time before he hurt himself, and sure enough the day came when he wouldn't answer the knocks at his study door. I broke in to find him lying dead in a pool of blood, with deep gouges along his wrists and arms. The walls were covered in fractal drawings. Every surface was piled high with them, and pencil shavings littered the floor. The inquest ruled his death as suicide, although the coroner wasn't able to identify the tool that had made the cuts on his arms. Why he had such a look of fear on his face. This is why the apparent disappearance of Raymond Fielding worried me so much. I was younger than my father had been, but still had that possibility within me. This train of thought was likely why I wasn't paying as much attention as I should have been, where I was stepping and I slipped on the wet section of flooring that I had just cleaned. I fell forward, hitting my head badly. I don't think I was unconscious for more than a few seconds, but when I woke up, I was bleeding from a deep cut on my temple. I tried to make it to my car, but I was so dizzy just standing up that it was clear driving was out of the question. So I called for an ambulance. It arrived quickly and it took me to the John Radcliffe Hospital. When I got there, they were very responsive and quickly determined that I had quite a severe concussion, so I was kept overnight for observation. I told my doctor everything about my encounter with Raymond Fielding. If it was early signs of any developing schizophrenia, I wanted to know as soon as possible. The doctor listened closely and said it was unlikely, as it would be surprising if I developed full hallucinations so abruptly, but that they were keeping me under observation. I noticed as I was explaining my experience, the nurse taking my blood pressure seemed to be listening intently, though she left before I could ask her why. I stayed in that hospital for another 2 days. Sam wanted to cut short her trip when she heard about my concussion, but I told her that any real danger had passed and I should be fine until the end of her conference. So I was mostly on my own for that time. It was the morning before she was due to return that I saw the nurse again. I'd just had the news that the tests had all come back fine, so I was being discharged, and she came in to give me a final check. She asked me if I was sure the man who had come to the house on Hilltop Road had called himself Raymond Fielding. I told her yes, and that I'd even seen his signature on the deed to the land, but that I didn't know any of the history of the place. She got very quiet and sat down. This nurse was an older woman, Malaysian, I think, and I would have guessed in her 50s, though I didn't ask. She said her family had lived on Hilltop Road for a long time now, and she knew the place I was working. In the 1960s, the house that had stood there had belonged to a man named Raymond Fielding. He was a devout churchgoer and had used it as a halfway house on behalf of the local diocese, looking after teenage runaways and young people with mental problems. The neighborhood apparently hadn't liked it, as its residents often got into trouble and Hilltop Road had started to get something of a reputation for it. Nobody ever said a word against Raymond himself, though, who by all accounts was such a kind soul as to be almost universally beloved. Nobody was sure exactly when Agnes moved in. Some even said she was Raymond's actual daughter, as the two of them looked something alike and she was younger than most of the other kids living there. She couldn't have been more than 11 when she turned up, and didn't really talk, other than to tell people her name if asked. Everyone just started to notice this child with mousy brown pigtails staring at them through the windows of Raymond's house. As far as anyone could tell, that's all she ever seemed to do. Stare at people from the windows. It was unsettling, but no one had any real problem with it. Over the next few years, the kids at the halfway house stopped causing problems in the area around Hilltop Road. It wasn't an obvious change, but gradually the people living there were seen less and less. Raymond was still there and seemed perfectly cheery. If anyone asked him about a resident who hadn't been around for a while, he'd explain that they'd moved on, or found a place of their own, and no one really cared enough to follow up on his information. Soon the only people living in that old house were Agnes and Raymond. Then Raymond disappeared as well. Agnes must have been 18 or 19 by this point, and still hardly ever talked. When she was questioned about what happened to Raymond, she simply said he had gone away, and that the house was hers. People got a bit worried at that, and the police conducted a small investigation, but the house had been legally signed over to Agnes, and there was no sign of any foul play. No sign of Raymond either, for that matter. And so the years passed, and Agnes lived on in that old house. Hardly ever seemed to leave it, just watched from the windows. Folks in Hilltop Road learned it was best not to keep pets, as they tended to vanish. Then, in 1974, Henry White goes missing. 5 years old, and the search turned up nothing. People always whispered about Agnes, but now the whispers got nasty. Nasty enough that when smoke is seen pouring out of the old Fielding house a week after little Henry disappeared, no one did a thing. No one phoned the fire brigade or tried to help. They just watched. Agnes must not have phoned for assistance either, as by the time the fire trucks arrived there was nothing left to save. Through it all, nobody saw any sign of life from within the building. No screaming, no movement, nothing but the roaring of the flames. When the fire was finally put out, they did find human remains. But it wasn't Agnes, nor was it Henry White. The only body they found was that of Raymond Fielding. All that was left was a badly charred skeleton, missing its right hand. That was the history of the place as the nurse told it to me. Once the rubble had been cleared away, the land had become tied up in legal complications relating to the ownership, and had remained so until earlier last year. She asked me not to let anyone else know she'd been talking about it, as she didn't want people to think she had been spreading stories. I told her I'd keep quiet, and she left. I didn't see her again, and was discharged soon afterwards. I rested at home for a couple of days, but I find forced inactivity very boring, and my head was feeling fine, so I decided to go back to work. By all rights, I should probably have avoided returning to Hilltop Road, but I found myself resenting how the house made me feel. I didn't believe in ghosts, to be honest. I'm still not sure I do, and had been assured by the doctor that I wasn't displaying any other symptoms of schizophrenia. So there was no reason for me to feel this gnawing apprehension. I convinced myself that the only way to banish the feeling was to return and finish the job that I started. So that's what I did, although I was careful to work only in daylight now, and tried to avoid being alone. Even so, there were occasional moments when I would find myself the only one working in a room, or when silence fell across the building. And then I would smell it again, that whiff of burnt hair, or catch a glimpse of brown pigtails disappearing around a corner. As the job drew towards a close, it became harder to avoid working there after dark, until I lost track of time completely one afternoon, and looked up to see that not only had night fallen, but I was the only one left in the building. Almost as soon as I realized this, I began to sweat. At first I thought it was nerves, or even a panic attack at finding myself alone, but it was the heat. This warmth that seemed to start in my bones and radiate out through me. I took off my hat and jacket, but I just got hotter and hotter until it felt like I was cooking from the inside. I tried to scream, but I couldn't find my breath. I couldn't move. I was burning up. There was a knock at the door and the feeling abruptly vanished. I was cold again, lying on the bare floor. I struggled to my feet as the knock came again. My hand shook as I opened it. By now I didn't know what to expect. Would it be Raymond again, Agnes, or some other thing to announce the end of my sanity? What I did not expect was a Catholic priest. He was short and a bit portly, with close-cropped hair and deep smile lines around his mouth. He introduced himself as Father Edwin Burrows and told me that Annie had asked him to pay the place a visit. I didn't know any Annie and told him so, and he seemed slightly confused, said she worked as a nurse at the John Radcliffe Hospital. This allayed my fears enough that I let him in, and I asked him if he was some sort of exorcist. Father Burrows smiled and told me yes, that's exactly what he was. So I told him my story as he went around examining the house. He nodded as I went through what happened, occasionally asking a question about what had been said or how I had felt. Finally, he seemed satisfied and said he'd do what he could. He explained that exorcism was really only for demons, and it wasn't something he could do to ghosts, at least not officially. Whether or not ghosts actually existed was apparently just as divisive a question within the church as outside of it. But he would go through some blessings and see if he could help. He asked me to wait outside while he worked, so I headed into the back garden and waited. As I stood there in the cold, my eyes fell on the tree. That creepy damn tree. I don't know why, but at that moment I felt an intense, maddening anger at that tree. I picked up a crowbar that lay on a nearby pile of wood, and drawing my arm back, I swung it at the trunk, burying it with all my might. I felt something warm and wet spray out where I had hit it. Sap? No, it didn't feel like sap. I turned on my torch to see blood flowing from the wounded tree. It ran down the crowbar and dripped onto the earth, running in rivulets. As it reached the roots, I saw something else in my torch's light. Curling up from the base of that tree were old, black scorch marks. At that moment I made my decision. It was easy. Like destroying this tree was the only thing to do, the only path to follow. I found a long chain among the building materials in the garden and wrapped it around the still bleeding trunk, then attached the ends to my car. It took me less than a minute to pull it down, and there was no more blood. When the tree lay on its side, uprooted and powerless, I gazed into the hole where it had sat, and noticed something lying there in the dirt. Climbing down, I retrieved what turned out to be a small wooden box, about 6 inches square, with an intricate pattern carved along the outside. Engraved lines covered it, warping and weaving together, making it hard to look away. I opened the box, and sitting inside was a single green apple. It looked fresh, shiny, with a coat of condensation like it had just been picked on a cool spring morning. I picked it up. I wasn't going to eat it, I'm not that stupid. But more than bleeding trees or phantom burning, this confused me. As I took it out of the box, though, it began to turn. The skin turned brown and bruised and started to shrivel in my hand. Then it split, and out came spiders. Dozens, hundreds of spiders erupting from this apple that was rotting right before my eyes. I shrieked and dropped it before any of them could touch my arm. The apple fell to the ground and burst in a cloud of dust. I backed away quickly and waited until I was sure all of the spiders had left before retrieving the box. I smashed it with a crowbar and threw the remains into a skip. Father Burroughs returned shortly afterwards. He told me he'd done his prayers and hoped that it would be some help. If he noticed the felled tree, he didn't ask any questions about it. Instead, he just handed me his business card and told me to give him a call if there were any further problems. The house didn't feel any different, but there was no smell of burnt hair, no heat or ghosts or any weirdness I could see. I worked on that house for another week. I don't know if it was the father's prayers or my uprooting the tree, but I didn't encounter anything else unusual during my time there. After that, my part of the job was finished. I haven't been back to Hilltop Road since. Statement ends. Head trauma and latent schizophrenia, the ghost's best friends. Aside from excessive indulgence in psychoactive drugs, it seems to me that there is simply no better way to make contact with the spirit world. Still, glibness aside, the history of 105 Hilltop Road does bear investigation, and while I trust Mr. Lensick's testimony of his own experiences about as far as I can throw a bleeding tree, there is a note in the file mentioning that Father Edwin Burroughs put down his own version of these events in Statement 02180111. While I have yet to locate that particular file in the chaos that passed for Gertrude Robinson's archive, the suggestion that there may be external corroboration does lend some potential credence to Mr. Lensick's wild tale. No other workers on the building site at the time reported any disturbances like the ones reported by Mr. Lensick. Martin was unable to find the exact date the original house was built, but the earliest records he could find listed as being bought by Walter Fielding in 1891. It was inherited by his son Alfred Fielding in 1923, and then by his grandson Raymond Fielding in 1957. There was no record of it being used as a halfway house, certainly not one connected to the local Catholic diocese, although the Church of England records for the area that Sasha got access to were unfortunately incomplete. The older residents of Hilltop Road back up the account given by the nurse Anna Kasuma, as related here. Tim managed to organize an interview with Mrs. Kasuma, but apparently she could provide no information beyond what she told to Mr. Lensick. She did admit, though, to asking Father Burroughs to have a look at the house, as she was worried about it, and had seen him perform exorcisms before. There doesn't seem to be any print evidence of what happened to the house, no news stories or similar regarding the fire, but one resident did provide a photograph of the house in flames. Raymond Fielding's obituary briefly reported his death as having been due to a house fire, and lauds his work with troubled youth, but gives no details about either. Agnes remains something of a mystery, as we have not been able to find any definitive proof that she even existed. Except, we cannot prove any connection, but Martin unearthed a report on an Agnes Montague, who was found dead in her Sheffield flat on the evening of November 23rd, 2006, the same day Mr. Lensick claims to have uprooted the tree. She had hanged herself. Her age is given at 26, which doesn't match up at all, but tied by a chain to her waist was a severed human hand, a right hand. Its owner was never identified, but the coroner was apparently quite perplexed, as tissue decay would seem to indicate that the hand's original owner must have died at almost the exact same time as Agnes. 2 families have lived in the house since this statement was originally made, but no further manifestations have been reported on Hilltop Road. End recording.
The Magnus Archives is a podcast distributed by rustyquill.com and licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike International License. Today's episode was written and performed by Jonathan Sims. It was produced by Alexander J. Newell, Mike LeBeau, and Murray Porter, and directed by Alexander J. Newell. To comment on episodes, make donations, and view links, images, videos, and show notes, visit rustyquill.com. Rate and review us on iTunes, visit us on Facebook, tweet us on Twitter @TheRustyQuill, or email us at mail@rustyquill.com. Thanks for listening. Rusty Quill presents The Magnus Archives. Episode 5, Thrown Away.
Statement of Kieran Woodward regarding items recovered from the refuse of 93 Lancaster Road, Walthamstow. Original statement given February 23rd, 2009. Audio recording by Jonathan Sims, Head Archivist of the Magnus Institute, London. Statement begins. I work as a bin man for Waltham Forest Council. It's not a bad job really, as long as you can handle the smell in the early mornings. Not to mention that when winter really gets going, it can be pretty unpleasant. I've had to chip ice off more than a few bins in my time just to get them open. Still, the pay's pretty decent. At least it is once you throw in the overtime and the bonuses, and once you've done the rounds, you're usually off for the day, so you're working fewer hours than your average office monkey. It's just that those hours tend to be a lot less pleasant than anything you're likely to find staring at some accounting spreadsheet. But I didn't come here to talk about the benefits and problems of working in waste collection. At least, I guess I came to talk about one very specific problem that I encountered last year when doing the rubbish collection for 93 Lancaster Road. Now, you encounter weird things in this job all the time. People have an odd mental block, this idea that as soon as they put something in the bin, it's gone. It's officially been made rubbish and no one will ever see it again. The fact that someone had to take it from your bin to the landfill or the recycling centre doesn't really enter their heads. And nobody ever seems to realize that up to a dozen people might be seeing what you throw away before it finally disappears forever. But no, as far as the rest of the world thinks about it, once it's been thrown away, it's gone, far beyond all human understanding. This leaves those of us who work in waste collection seeing kind of a strange side to humanity, but an honest one at that. If you're a bit of a boozer, there's every chance that your bin men know how much you drink better than you do, because we empty all the bottles. And yes, we do remember. We also get quite judgmental at times, although not about the things you might think. You can throw away a mountain of grotesque porn, and as long as you've tied it into neat bundles, we're fine with it. But if you throw away cat litter without properly bagging that, you better believe that you've earned the hatred of every bin man that ever slung a sack. Still, I'm getting off topic. Point is, the bag of doll's heads didn't bother me. I mean, it was freaky, don't get me wrong. Hundreds of small plastic heads staring out of the refuse sack at me. But aside from a slight rip on the side of the black bag, they were thrown away very neatly, and were easy enough to toss into the truck. The bag was full of them, mind. It was placed next to the green recycling bin, and at first I thought it was just a single doll with its head positioned near the tear. But when I tossed the bag into the truck, the rip split, spilling forth a whole bunch of the things. At a guess, I'd say there were over 100 in there. They were made of hard, rigid plastic with that infant doll face that you seem to find on every toy like that. Several of them had different hair moulded or painted on, so it was clear that they weren't simply from 100 or so of the same doll. Someone had spent time acquiring a whole variety of different dolls, which they then beheaded and stuffed into the sack. They were very battered, but not with age. It looked as though someone had taken the brand new heads and dragged them over rough concrete, though I couldn't say whether they'd have been attached to the rest of the doll at the time. It was creepy, sure, but the sun was shining and there were 4 of us working the truck that day, so it was easy enough to laugh it off. It was the old crew, me, David Atiyah, Matthew Wilkinson and Alan Parfit, who drove the truck. What it did do, though, was mark out 93 Lancaster Road in our minds as the dollhouse, since we spent the rest of the day making off-colour jokes about the sort of people who must live there. I said before that your bin man knows a lot about you. Now that's probably not actually true for most people. We service hundreds of homes each day, and who can keep track of that many people? Who wants to? You do have houses, though, that you learn to keep an eye on. The sort of places that throw out strange or sometimes even dangerous things. Like I said, we probably know if you're an alcoholic, but it's not because we watch you obsessively or care about your health. It's because smashed bottles and broken glass are dangerous, and you learn to keep an eye out around houses where you're likely to find them. I read once that waste collection is the second most dangerous profession in England. Not sure I believe it. They said the first was farming. But you do see your fair share of injuries, so you learn to keep your eyes peeled and mark out in your mind which houses you want to stay wary of. Now, after that, the dollhouse became one of those houses for our crew. Not so much for any known danger, but when someone throws out a bin full of weird stuff like that, you never know what else they might decide to toss. Also, Alan, well, he had kind of a twisted sense of humour, and he loved the doll heads. When we told him, he insisted on stopping the truck and getting out to have a look. So after that, he always made a point to ask us to keep an eye on 93. And we did. The next couple of weeks, when we pulled up to 93, I took an extra second or two just to check for anything strange in the bins, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Alan especially was disappointed by this, but it was hardly something to dwell on, so we put it out of our minds and pressed on with the day's work. This continued for what must have been a few months, and the whole doll's head incident hadn't come up, except for a few interesting conversations at the recycling plant where, to be honest, I don't think anyone believed us, or if they did, they'd immediately try to top it with their own story of bizarre finds. It was the start of spring when we got the next strange bag from 93 Lancaster Road. Again, it was an unmarked black refuse bag placed next to the recycling bin. As soon as I saw it, I knew it was another one. The shape of it was too regular to be full of the normal assortment of rubbish. As I picked it up, I realized it was far too light as well. It seemed to weigh almost nothing, but was bulging with what sounded like a whole load of paper inside. I gave the others a look, and told them I thought we had another odd bag. David and Matt started discussing whether we should open it, as this one didn't seem to have a rip like the last one, and we were still talking it over when Alan came back to see what was taking us so long. He knew where we were, and you could see it in his eyes that he'd been hoping this was the reason for the delay. One look at his face, and I knew that if we didn't open it, he would. I looked up towards the house, checking for anyone watching, but 93 was right near the start of our route, so it was still very early in the morning and all the lights were off. There was no sign of movement, so, very carefully, I opened the bag. Inside was paper, as I expected. It seemed to be a single strip of thick white writing paper, maybe an inch wide. The paper was long, so long that it seemed like the whole bag was filled solely with this one piece of it, wrapped and curled and crumpled to fit inside. There was writing on it in another language, I think Latin. Matt, who was raised Catholic and never shut up about it, said he recognized it and claimed that it was the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father, written over and over again. He seemed pretty rattled about it, especially at the fact that at certain points the edges of the paper seemed to be slightly singed, as though it had been passed over a candle or a lighter. He even seemed hesitant about throwing it in with the rest of the garbage, but we didn't have anything else we could actually do with it, so into the truck it went. Alan was smiling the rest of the shift, and there was a delight there that, quite frankly, had started to unsettle me a bit. As far as I was concerned, this was a bit of a letdown after the doll's heads, but the way the others had reacted put me a bit on edge. The third bag was the one that really changed things. It was a fortnight after the one with the prayer paper in it. As we approached 93, I noticed there was another bag sitting next to the bin. The others clearly noticed as well, as everyone went very quiet. The first two had been the only times there had been rubbish bags at the house that weren't in the actual bin itself, so there was little doubt in my mind that this was going to be more creepy trash. Alan turned the engine off as we pulled level with the house and got out. Whatever was in this one, he was going to see it. The bag bulged, just like the others, but had a bumpy sort of look to its surface. We all stared at it for several seconds before I realized that the others were waiting for me to pick it up. I'd picked up the others, and apparently this was how it was done now. It almost felt like a ritual. I walked over and lifted it off the ground. It was heavier than the last one, and as it moved it made a sound like shifting sand or gravel, or maybe more of a rattle. I started to carry it towards my colleagues to open it, when I accidentally caught the bottom of it on the low brick wall at the end of the small front garden. Already filled almost to bursting, the bag tore open easily. From the newly ripped hole poured teeth. Hundreds, thousands of teeth. They came streaming down in a waterfall of white, cream and yellow, bouncing as they hit the pavement and gradually forming a pile of astounding size. When the bag was finally empty, we just stood there in silence, staring at the mountain of teeth that now lay on the ground before us. They looked like human teeth to me, but I wasn't exactly an expert, and I sure as hell didn't want to check closer. Finally, David broke the silence by vomiting loudly into a nearby drain, and I backed away from the grisly mound. Even Alan looked shaken by this. I suppose some things are disconcerting, however grim your interests. We phoned the police. That's something else that people always forget about garbage men. We're perfectly capable of calling the police if we see obviously illegal stuff being thrown away. Usually we don't bother if it's just something small, but for this we phoned the police. They came in surprisingly good time, and I reckon they were even more freaked out than we were. One of them took our statements while the other went up to the house itself to check on the occupants and see if they knew anything about the teeth. As the officer knocked on the door, we all strained to get a better look at what greeted her. There was no way after all this we were going to pass up a chance to actually get a look at the residents of 93 Lancaster Road. Eventually the door opened, and an old woman stood there, blinking in the early morning sunlight and clearly slightly alarmed to see the police. Needless to say, the old lady and her husband had no idea about any of the weird bags that had been appearing in their rubbish, and seemed properly upset when they were given the details. The police spent a good 10 minutes doing their best to collect up all the teeth, and we were sent on our way. I have no idea what, if anything, the investigation turned up. Certainly I was never contacted by them again, and if any of the rest were, they didn't mention it. And for a while that was it. We kept an eye out whenever we were headed down Lancaster Road, but didn't encounter any further ominous garbage bags. I thought maybe the involvement of the police had scared off whoever was leaving them. Maybe the police had caught the culprit and just hadn't told us. I did start to notice, though, that Alan wasn't doing well. He was often late to his shift, and when he finally got there he'd be exhausted and grumpy, snapping at everyone and rudely brushing off anyone asking about his health or how he was doing. He seemed even worse whenever we approached the end of Lancaster Road, sometimes speeding up the truck slightly so that we had to run to keep up. Eventually, after I tripped over the curb while hurrying and twisted my ankle, I confronted him, told me that whatever was going on with him, he could talk about it or get over it, but that he clearly needed to deal with something. He got very quiet, and said he'd been watching number 93 some nights. Said he wanted to see whoever was dropping this stuff off, that he had to know. I don't know what I expected. Trouble at home maybe, or depression, but this took me by surprise. I told him it was a really bad idea, that if the police were still investigating, they were more than likely to pick him up as the culprit, and even if they didn't, the old couple at 93 could just as easily get him arrested for harassment or stalking. Alan nodded along and agreed with me as I spoke, but I could see he wasn't listening. He just said again that he needed to know, told me he'd be careful, as though that was meant to reassure me. It didn't, but I could see I wasn't going to talk him out of it, and we ended in an uncomfortable silence. What I didn't say is that I'd almost done the same thing myself once or twice. There was something about this, beyond anything else I'd encountered, that, I don't know, it drew me in almost as much as it disgusted me. Almost, but not enough to do anything. And if I needed any further convincing that leaving it alone was the right decision, I only needed to look at Alan. As time went on, the bags under his eyes deepened, and I'd watch him down half a dozen energy drinks over the course of a morning just to get through his shift. I could have said something to our manager, but even then Alan was still my friend, and I didn't want to be the one to get him in any sort of trouble. Eventually, though, it came to a head anyway. Alan fell asleep at the wheel of the truck and drove it into a parked car. No one was hurt and the truck was going too slowly to do any real damage, but at that point it was enough to get him fired. We were sad to see him go, but to be honest, by the end of it he'd become quite unpleasant to be around, and no one shed any real tears over it. We got a new member of our crew, a kid named Guy Wardman, and life continued in relative peace. For a while, anyway. Then, on the 8th of August last year, at 2:09 in the morning, I was woken up by a text message from Alan. It said, "Found him." I texted him back immediately. What had he found? Was it whoever was leaving the bags? Had he brought another one? No response. I texted Alan again to ask if he was okay. I sent that text a lot of times, but never heard back. I tried phoning him, but nobody answered. As the minutes stretched to hours, the worry that had been growing in my gut settled into a grim certainty, and I knew that Alan was gone. I also knew that I had to go to 93 Lancaster Road and see for myself. I got my coat and headed out into the night. I walked slowly, with a kind of reluctance, so the sky was starting to get light by the time I arrived. I knew what I'd find when I got there, and I was right. There was no sign of Alan, or of whoever he might have seen. There was, however, a new rubbish bag sitting there in its usual place. It was full, and this time the top of it had been tied off with a dark green ribbon, arranged in a bow like an old-fashioned Christmas present. It bulged in much the same way as the last one. I picked up the bag, which turned out to be quite light, and I took off the bow. Opening it, I saw shifting white, and for a second I was sure it was more teeth. Looking closer, though, I saw the truth. Packing peanuts. Polystyrene packing peanuts, enough to fill the bag to capacity. I almost felt relieved, until I realized there was something else in there, something making it heavier than a bag of polystyrene should be. I closed my eyes and reached in, expecting to find something horrible inside. My hand closed instead around cold metal, and I drew out a fist-sized lump of, I think it must have been copper or bronze. It had been roughly carved into the shape of a heart, but like a real heart, not like a Valentine's one. It was cold to the touch, like it had just come out of a freezer, and it almost stuck to my skin. Engraved on the side was the name Alan Parfitt, the letters carved in with machine-like precision. That was the last sign of Alan I ever found. As far as I'm aware, he's never been seen since. I gave the lump of metal to a friend of mine who works the medical waste run and owes me a favour. I asked him to throw it in with the shipment, as the medical incinerators burn hotter than any I have access to, and I figured that was my best shot at getting rid of it properly. I still work the Lancaster Road route, but since then there haven't been any more weird bags turning up at 93. Mostly I've just tried to forget about it. Statement ends. It's nice to have a statement where most of the particulars are easily verifiable. It comes with shorter supporting statements from David Attire and Matthew Wilkinson confirming the contents of the first 3 bags, as well as the details of Alan Parfitt's behaviour prior to his termination from the employment of local government. In an uncharacteristic example of actually dealing with modern technology, my predecessor had the good sense to make a copy of the final text conversation between Alan Parfitt and Mr. Woodward. I had Martin conduct a follow-up interview with Mr. Woodward last week, but it was unenlightening. Apparently there have been no further bags at number 93, and in the intervening years he has largely discounted many of the stranger aspects of his experience. I wasn't expecting much, as time generally makes people inclined to forget what they would rather not believe, but at least I got Martin out of the Institute for an afternoon, which is always a welcome relief. Sasha had more luck following up with the old police reports. Alan Parfitt was reported as a missing person by his brother Michael on the 20th of August 2009, and his location remains unknown. The bag of teeth is also corroborated by the police reports of police constables Suresh and Altman, though they can provide no further details as they never made an arrest or even located any suspects. The medical report on the teeth themselves does give one puzzling detail. The teeth were confirmed to be human, but more than that, as far as the examiner was able to determine, they were all in different stages of decay and didn't match any available dental records, but all 2,780 of them were the exact same tooth. End recording.
The Magnus Archives is a podcast distributed by rustyquill.com and licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike International License. Today's episode was written and performed by Jonathan Sims. It was produced and directed by Alexander J. Newell. To comment on episodes, make donations and view links, images, videos, and show notes, visit rustyquill.com. Rate and review us on iTunes, visit us on Facebook, tweet us on Twitter @TheRustyQuill, or email us at mail@rustyquill.com. Thanks for listening. Rusty Quill presents The Magnus Archives. Episode 6. Squirm.
Statement of Timothy Hodge regarding his sexual encounter with one Harriet Lee and her subsequent death. Original statement given December 9th, 2014. Audio recording by Jonathan Sims, head archivist of the Magnus Institute, London. Statement begins. I don't know what happened. I'm sure she's dead, but I don't. Let me start from the beginning. I work as a designer, mainly freelance with a few more regular gigs with companies who like my work. I also had, the luxury of a flat I'd managed to get set up so I could do most of my work there. This meant when I have a big job, I spent quite a lot of time not leaving my home. Not the most stable of employment, but I got quite good at balancing it so that after a big project I left myself a few days or maybe even a week before I had to get started on the next one. I find it's important that I use this time to unwind and blow off a bit of steam, as when I've got work I often end up missing out on the regular weekend. Drinking and clubbing are my relaxation methods of choice, usually down Camden or Old Street. And while I'll admit I'm not above the occasional party drug, I swear that I was stone cold sober when all this took place. That night in particular, it was about 3 weeks ago now. I'd just finished a big job for one of my more demanding clients, and I wanted to get a bit wrecked. Unfortunately, none of my friends were free to join me, not surprising as it was a Thursday in the middle of November, so it didn't feel worth heading all the way into the city. Luckily, I live in Brixton, which means I have a few decent options almost on my doorstep, and I happened to know that the Dog Star ran a pretty decent club night on Thursdays. I decided to go along and enjoy myself. I did enjoy myself in the end, despite the crowds and the music. I wasn't feeling quite as wild as I expected, but I drank a bit and danced plenty. Okay, maybe I wasn't quite as sober as I said earlier, but I certainly wouldn't have called myself drunk. Now, I wasn't particularly looking to get laid that night, but I know I'm not an unattractive guy and I live local, so I'm always alert, shall we say, for any possibility of finding myself a partner. It was closing in on midnight when I saw her. She was skinny and had that student look which could have put her age anywhere between 19 and 28. Her hair was long, dyed a deep henna red, and she wore torn tights and too much eyeliner. Exactly the sort of girl I go for. She was lurking on the dance floor, and I wasted no time trying to catch her eye. It was harder than I'd guessed, though, as her attention seemed to be mainly focused on the doors. At first I thought she was waiting for someone, but the more I watched her, the more I saw the nervousness in her eyes, maybe even fear. It was at that point she noticed me, and our eyes just locked, you know. She came over and we began to dance together. She was excellent, far better than me, and moved in a smooth, rolling sort of rhythm that made the word writhe leap suddenly to my mind. I offered her a drink, but she refused, gesturing instead for water, which I happily got. I couldn't really hear her over the music, but you don't go to these nights for conversation. Besides, I heard her loud and clear when she leaned over and asked me if I wanted her. I said yes. Looking back, it was stupid, of course it was, but she was beautiful, and there was something in the way she moved that really got me. She smiled when I said yes, and for a moment it looked less like a smile of anticipation, and more like a smile of relief. Outside the Dog Star it was much quieter, and we had a chance to talk. She told me her name was Harriet, and she was very pleased to hear I lived locally, as it was a cold night. She held my arm tightly as we walked back towards my street. At first I thought this was for warmth, as she didn't have a coat, and I doubted the light jacket she was wearing had much insulation. When I looked at her, though, I saw she was looking around the same way she'd been watching the door earlier. Her nervousness was even more obvious now, and she was peering intently down every street we passed. I asked her if anything was wrong, and tried to tell her that I lived in a nice neighborhood, she was perfectly safe, that sort of thing. She nodded and agreed, but still seemed jumpy. When we were about halfway, she started scratching her arms. At first I thought she was just rubbing them for warmth, but after a few seconds it became clear that she was scratching them quite hard, leaving obvious red marks where her fingernails dug in. I was starting to suspect something was wrong, and asked Harriet if there was anything the matter, anything I should know. She just insisted we head back to my place as quickly as possible. I agreed, since I figured that whatever the problem was, we could deal with it easier in my flat than on the cold streets at midnight. By the time we reached my building, she was staring over her shoulder in near panic. I followed her gaze, but couldn't see anything, so quickly opened the front door and let her in. She seemed to relax a bit once we were both in the relatively warm corridor with the door shut firmly behind us. My flat was on the 3rd floor, and even though, as I said, I don't live in a bad area, I did have an extra deadlock on my door. Harriet visibly relaxed when she saw it, and more so when it was closed. The skittish glances and scratching her arms stopped almost immediately. I offered her a coffee or tea to warm up. She just asked for a glass of water, said she was feeling a bit unwell. We sat down, and once I'd fetched her water and fixed myself a coffee, we talked for a while. My instincts had been right. She was a student, studying art. She hadn't been in London long, she said, was originally from Salisbury, and had been finding it difficult recently. When she left that pause, I saw in her eyes hints of that panic I'd seen on the street. I asked her to tell me what was wrong, said something was clearly bothering her and I'd like to help. She got very quiet for a few moments and then nodded. She told me she'd been mugged the night before last, although the way she said the word mugged made it sound like she wasn't sure. I just nodded and let her continue talking. She lived up an archway on a street named Elthorne Road, and had been walking home around midnight when she saw a woman lying face down on the pavement. This woman wore a long red dress, and Harriet said she could see it shifting in the orange glow of the street lamps, as though something was moving underneath it. Harriet was close to her house, which she shared with several other students, so she said she was maybe less careful than she should have been, and had approached, calling out and asking if the woman needed help. There was no response, but all movement stopped, and the red dress went very still. Suddenly, far quicker than Harriet could have expected, the woman leapt to her feet and sprinted directly towards her, seizing her by the shoulders and pushing her back against a nearby wall. It happened so fast that Harriet said she had never really gotten a good look at the woman beyond her dress, a head of long matted black hair and wide staring eyes. The woman growled something at her, but Harriet couldn't make it out. She tried to ask what the mugger wanted, but as she did she felt a sudden pain in her stomach as though she'd been stabbed, which is exactly what she thought had happened. She told me that she had fallen to the ground and lost consciousness almost immediately. When she awoke, the woman in the red dress was gone. Harriet had expected to find herself lying in a pool of blood from her stomach wound, but could instead find no trace of any injury anywhere, except for some scraped knees where she had fallen to the floor. She had staggered home and tried to sleep it off. Since then, she said she'd been seeing that woman everywhere she went. She felt like she was being followed all the time and couldn't stay in her own home, as whenever she did, it was like this weight was dragging her down. Her skin became so itchy as to be nearly unbearable. Harriet had apparently tried to go to the police, but said as she approached the station she was overcome with such a powerful nausea that she threw up on the pavement. She had tried the hospital, but they just told her there was nothing obvious and to make an appointment with her doctor. She had been spending the last 3 days just wandering in cafes and bars and clubs, anywhere there were enough people that she felt safe. She just didn't know what to do. By now Harriet was crying, and I felt like a complete asshole for having brought the issue up. I mumbled some apologies. I don't know what I said. I was just trying to make her feel better. Not sure what I expected to happen, but I certainly didn't expect her to kiss me at that moment. I know, she was vulnerable, and I feel like but I swear I wasn't trying to take advantage. I asked her again and again if she was sure, but she just kept nodding and dragged me to the bedroom. I mean, we had sex. There's not much more to say about that, really. The important thing is what happened afterwards. As we were lying there in bed, exhausted, I rested my head against her shoulder. I was about to say something or other, but before I could, I felt something move. It's hard to describe exactly, but it wasn't her shoulder that moved. It was something inside it, under the skin. It squirmed ever so slightly against my cheek. I shot up in bed, but the only indication that she'd noticed anything amiss was that she reached over and absent-mindedly scratched where I'd been lying. I started to relax, lie down again. Maybe I'd just imagined it, but at that moment she doubled over and groaned in sudden pain. Her eyes went wide and she clutched her stomach tightly. I tried to see what was wrong, asked if I could help, but she just pushed me away. I had no idea what to do, so I ran out and towards the bathroom. My mind was going completely blank, and I couldn't remember whether I had any painkillers or indigestion medicine, or should I be calling an ambulance? I wasn't sure, and I ended up rooting through my medicine cabinet looking for, I don't know, anything that might have helped. I could still hear Harriet moaning in agony from the bedroom, and had just made up my mind to call for an ambulance when I heard something that stopped me dead in my tracks. It's hard to really describe the sound that came from the bedroom. The closest I could come would be to say it sounded like an egg being dropped onto a stone floor, a sort of wet, cracking thump. And then silence. Harriet was no longer making any noise at all. I slowly, very slowly walked back towards the bedroom. The door was open, but I hadn't turned the light on, so there was little to be seen inside except darkness. I could have turned on the light in the hall, I suppose, but something inside made me think that I didn't want a good look inside that room. I stopped at the threshold. The only illumination at all came from a thin sliver of light coming in through the gap in the curtains from a street lamp outside. You'll have to excuse me. What I saw is difficult to put down on paper, but it's the only way to explain why I had to do it. Why setting my flat alight and standing naked in the winter streets until the fire brigade arrived was far better than spending another second in that place. And yes, I admit here I set the fire myself. Show it to the police for all I care, I just need someone to understand. The room was unrecognizable when I returned. There was a shape on the bed where Harriet had laid, but it wasn't her anymore. I could barely make out anything, even remotely human, in the pile of pitted and warped flesh that now remained. The bed itself was slick and shiny with a dark fluid that dripped off the hanging sheets and onto the floor. But what truly repulsed me, what made me flee as I did, was what moved and squirmed on all of it. They covered every surface, the floor, the bed, what used to be Harriet, even the ceiling. A thick, moving carpet of pale, writhing worms. The flat burned for a very long time. Statement ends. This story is concerning, not because of Mr. Hodges' experience, although I'm sure it was very upsetting, if it was true, of course. In fact, the police report that Sasha was able to acquire throws doubt on much of his story. While Mr. Hodges' flat did indeed catch fire on November 20th of last year, there was apparently no evidence of arson and no human remains found inside, despite the fact that the fire was brought under control long before any significant damage was done to the structure of the building. They did find some charred organic matter in the bedroom, but it was tested and apparently wasn't human, though the report doesn't list whether its source was ever determined. I will say it does link up with the reported disappearance of one Harriet Lee, a student at Roehampton, who was reported missing shortly after this statement was originally given. She seems to match the description given here. Still, that's not really what concerns me either, though obviously it's a tragic loss of life, etc., etc. No. What I find quite alarming is that if Mr. Hodges' recollection of Harriet's tale is correct, and she was attacked by a woman in a red dress in Archway, then that matches the description and last known location of Jane Prentice. I can't find any evidence that my predecessor took follow-up action on this statement, so I've taken the step of reporting Mr. Hodges to the ECDC. We were unable to locate him to request a follow-up interview, and if he has had intercourse with one of Prentice's victims, then they'll need to deal with him sooner rather than later. I just hope it's not too late already. Recording ends.
The Magnus Archives is a podcast distributed by rustyquill.com and licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike International License. Today's episode was written and performed by Jonathan Sims. It was produced by Alexander J. Newell, Mike LeBeau, and Murray Porter, and directed by Alexander J. Newell. To comment on episodes, make donations and view links, images, videos, and show notes, visit rustyquill.com. Rate and review us on iTunes, visit us on Facebook, tweet us on Twitter at The Rusty Quill, or email us at mail@rustyquill.com. Thanks for listening. Rusty Quill presents the Magnus Archives. Episode 7, The Piper.
Statement of Staff Sergeant Clarence Berry regarding his time serving with Wilfred Owen in the Great War. Original statement given November 6th, 1922. Audio recording by Jonathan Sims, Head Archivist of the Magnus Institute, London. Statement begins. A lot of people call me lucky, you know. Not many came through the entirety of the war in one piece, and if you discount the burns, then I did indeed do just that. Even fewer spent all 4 years at the front, like I did. I was never sent for treatment for shell shock or injury, and even my encounter with the German flamethrower only ended up with me in a frontline hospital at Wipers. I was still in that field hospital when the fighting started at the Somme, so I suppose that was lucky too. 4 years. I sometimes feel like I'm the only one who saw the whole damn show from start to finish, as though I alone know the Great War in all its awful glory. But deep down I know that honor, such as it is, has to go to Wilfred. You wouldn't have thought it from his poems, but all told his time at the front totaled not much over a year. Yet he got to know the war in a way I never did. He's certainly the only person I know that ever saw the Piper. I grew up poor, on the streets of Salford, so I joined the army as soon as I was old enough. I know you've heard the stories of brave lads signing up at 14, but this was before the war started, so there wasn't such a demand for manpower, and the recruiters were much more scrupulous about making sure those enlisting were of age. Even so, I was almost too skinny for them to take me, and barely made the required weight. But in the end I made it through, and after my training was assigned to the Manchester Regiment, 2nd Battalion, and it wasn't long before we were shipped off to France with the British Expeditionary Force. You seem like educated sorts, so I'm sure you read in the papers how that went. Soon enough, though, the trenches were dug and the boredom started to set in. Now, boredom is fine, understand, when the alternative are bombs, snipers, and gas attacks, but months at a time sitting in a waterlogged hole in the ground hoping your foot doesn't start swelling, well, it has a quiet terror all its own. Wilfred came to us in July of 1916. I'm not intimately familiar with his history, but he clearly came from stock good enough to be assigned as a probationary 2nd lieutenant. I was a sergeant at the time, so had the job of giving him the sort of advice and support that a new officer needs from an NCO with 2 years of mud under his nails. That notwithstanding, I will admit to taking a dislike to the man when I first met him. He outranked me and most of the others in the trench in both military and social terms, and he seemed to treat the whole affair with an airy contempt. There's a sort of numbness that you adopt after months or years of bombing, a deliberate blankness which I think offended him. He was unfailingly polite, far more so than I was accustomed to in the Flanders mud, where the conversations, such as they were coarse and bleak. Yet under this politeness I could feel him dismiss out of hand any suggestion that I gave him or report that I made. It came as no surprise to me when he mentioned he wrote poetry. To be perfectly honest, I expected him to be dead within a week. To Wilfred's credit, he made it almost a year before anything horrendous happened to him, and by the following spring I'd venture to say that we might almost have been able to call each other friends. He'd been composing poetry during this time, of course, and occasionally would read it out to some of the men. They generally enjoyed it, but personally I thought it was dreadful. There was an emptiness to it, and every time he tried to put the war into words it just sounded trite, like there was no soul to what he had to say. He would often talk about his literary aspirations and how he longed to be remembered, to take what this war truly was and immortalize it. Were I prone to flights of fancy, I dare say I would call his words portentous. When he talked like that, he had an odd habit of trailing off in the middle of the conversation with a tilt of his head, as though his attention had been taken by a far-off sound. The spring thaw had just recently passed when it happened, and we were on the offensive. Our battalion was near Savvy Wood when the orders came down. We were to attack the Hindenburg line. Our target was a trench on the west side of St. Quentin. It was a quiet march. Even at this stage there was often still some excitement when the orders came down for action, even if it was usually stifled by that choking fear that you got when waiting for the whistle. Yet that morning there was something different in the air, an oppressive dread. We'd made this attack before, and knew that the change from the valley exposed us to artillery fire, and artillery was always the scariest part of it for me. Bayonets you could dodge, bullets you could duck, even gas you could block out if you were lucky, but artillery? All you could do against artillery was pray. Even Wilfred felt it, I could tell. He was usually quite talkative before combat, morbid, but always talkative. That morning he didn't say a word. I tried to talk with him, raise his spirits as is a sergeant's duty, but he just held up his hand to quiet me, and turned his head to listen. At the time I didn't know what it was he was hearing, but it kept him silent. Even when we crested the ridge and the rest of us tried to drown out the deafening thrum of artillery with our own charging cry, even then he made no sound. The ground shook with the impact of the mortar shells, and I ran from foxhole to crater to foxhole, keeping my head low to avoid the bullets. As I ran, I felt a shooting pain in my ankle and pitched forward into the mud. Looking down, I saw I'd been caught by a length of barbed wire, half hidden by the damp upturned soil. I felt a surge of panic begin to overtake me, and frantically tried to remove the wire from my leg, but only succeeded in getting my hand scratched up quite badly. I looked around desperately to see if there was anyone else nearby who could help, and there, not 20 yards in front of me, I saw Wilfred standing, his face blank, and his head swaying to some unheard rhythm. And then I did hear it, gently riding over the pulse of mortars and the rattle of guns and the moans of dying men, a faint, piping melody. I could not have told you whether it was bagpipes or panpipes or some instrument I had never heard before, but its whistling tune was unmistakable. It struck me with the deepest sadness and a gentle, creeping fear. And in that moment I knew what was about to happen. I looked at Wilfred, and as our eyes met, I saw that he knew as well. I heard a single gunshot, much louder than any of the others somehow, and I saw him go stiff, his eyes wide. And then the mortar blast hit him, and he was lost in an eruption of mud and earth. I had plenty of time to mourn him, lying in that dreadful hole until nightfall, when I could free my leg as quietly and gently as possible before crawling back to our trench. It was slow going. Every time a flare went up, I could only lay motionless and pray. But the good Lord saw fit to let me reach our line relatively unscathed. I was quickly bundled off to the field hospital, which was overburdened as always. They didn't have much in the way of medicine or staff to spare, and certainly no beds free, so they washed my wounds with iodine, bandaged them, and sent me on my way, told me to come back if I got gangrene. I did have a look around the place to see if I could find Wilfred, but there was no sign of him to be found anywhere. Asking around the trench, no one had seen him return among the wounded, so I began to reconcile myself to the fact that he was dead. He wasn't the first friend I'd lost to the Germans, nor even the first I'd seen die in front of me, but something about that strange music that I heard in the moments before that explosion lingered in my mind, and left me dwelling on Wilfred in many a quiet moment. It was probably about a week and a half later I heard shouting from the end of the trench. It was a scouting party who had been reconnoitering the river that flowed near Savvy Wood. Apparently they had found a wounded officer lying in a shell hole there and brought him back. I made my way over and was astounded to see that it was Wilfred. His uniform was torn and burned, he was covered with blood, and his eyes had a distant, far-off expression to them. But he was most definitely alive. I rode with him back up to the field hospital, along with the corporal of the squad who had found him. Apparently he had been lying in that hole for days, ever since the battle. They'd found him there, half dead from dehydration and fatigue, covered in the gore of another soldier. Whatever shell had created the hole he'd ended up in had clearly annihilated some other poor soul, and it was in his gory remnants that Wilfred had lain for almost 2 weeks. I waited outside the hospital tent while he was being treated. The doctor came out shortly, a grave look on his face. He told me the lieutenant was physically unharmed, something I considered at the time nothing short of a miracle, but that he had one of the worst cases of shell shock the doctor had ever encountered, and would have to be shipped back to England for recuperation. I asked him if I could see him, and the doctor consented, though he warned me that Wilfred hadn't said a word since he'd been brought in. As soon as I stepped inside the medical tent, I was overwhelmed by the sweet scent of decaying flesh and the moans of pain and despair. The sharp smell of the disinfectant brought back unpleasant memories of chlorine gas attacks. Still, I eventually found my way over to Wilfred's bed, and sure enough, there he was, staring silently out at the world, though with an intensity that alarmed me. I followed his gaze to a bed nearby, and there I saw a private I didn't recognize. His forehead was slick with sweat, and his chest rose and fell quickly, then abruptly stopped. I realized with a start that a man had just died, and nobody had noticed except Wilfred. I tried to engage him in conversation, rattled off a few meaningless pleasantries. "How are you doing, old man? Heard you had a bit of a close call. Glad you found yourself a crump hole." All that sort of nonsense. None of it seemed to produce any reaction in him, and instead he turned to me, and after a long while he simply said, "I met the war." I told him that he certainly had. Not many walk away from something like that, and lying in that hole so long, surrounded by all that death, well, he had definitely met the war, and it was a rotten bloody business. But Wilfred just shook his head like I didn't understand, and to be honest, I was starting to feel like I didn't. And he told me again that he met the war. He said it was no taller than I was. It struck me that perhaps he was describing some dreadful mirage that had come upon him as he lay in that wretched place, and I asked him to tell me what the war looked like. I remember exactly what he said. He told me it had 3 faces, one to play its pipes of scrimshawed bone, one to scream its dying battle cry, and one that would not open its mouth, for when it did, blood and sodden soil flowed out like a waterfall. Those arms that did not play the pipes were gripping blades and guns and spears, while others raised their hands in futile supplication of mercy, and one in a crisp salute. It wore a tattered coat of wool, olive green where it was not stained black, and beneath nothing could be seen but a body, beaten, slashed, and shot, until nothing remained but the wounds themselves. I had heard quite enough by this point, and said so to Wilfred, but if he heard me, he gave no indication of it. He told me that the war, the piper, had come to claim him, and he had begged to remain. The thing had paused its tune for but a moment. With one of its arms, it reached out and handed him a pen. He said he knew it would return for him someday, but now he too would live to play its tune. The way he looked at me at that moment was the same way he'd looked at me before the shell hit. And for a moment, I could have sworn I once again heard that music on the breeze. I left almost immediately after that, and was later told that he'd been shipped back to Britain to recuperate at Craig Lockhart. The other men grumbled about officers' perks and a nice holiday for the lieutenant, but they didn't know what he'd been through, and I found it very hard to envy him myself. At one point I asked some of the squad who brought him back whether he'd been holding a pen when they found him, but they told me he hadn't. The only thing they'd found nearby were the tags of the dead man among his remains, a man named Joseph Rayner. And for a long while that was that. Wilfred was back at home recovering and taking on lighter duties while I slogged on through the mud of Flanders. I had a few close calls myself, including the flamethrower that marked me so distinctively. Could have been worse, of course. If the rain hadn't almost liquefied the mud of no man's land, I'd have gone up like a lucifer. I did start to notice something among the troops, though. Every time we lined up to go over the top, I would watch them, look into their faces. Most of them showed naught but the starkest fear, of course, but a few of them seemed distant. The whistle would startle them back to themselves, and with wide eyes they would surge forward. I had seen this before all that business with Wilfred, but had always assumed it was simply the mind trying to choke down the likelihood of its own death. Now, when I watched, I found I could not help but notice the slight tilt of the head, as though gently straining their ears to hear a far-off tune. Those men never made it back to the trenches. You know the phrase, to pay the piper? I thought on it a lot those many months. The debt of Hamlin, who for their greed had their children taken from them, never to be returned. Did you know Hamlin is a real place in Germany? Yes, not too far from Hanover, as I recall. We had a prisoner once from there. I wanted to ask him about the old fairy tale and what, if anything, he knew of the piper. The poor soul didn't speak a word of English, though, and died from an infected shrapnel wound a few days later. He spent his last minutes humming a familiar tune. That night, as we scrambled through mud and broken metal in another futile attack, I began to wonder, were we the children stolen from their parents by the piper's tune? Or were we the rats that were led to the river and drowned because they ate too much of the wealthy's grain? Still, those are musings for poets, among whom I do not number. I did keep up with the Wilfred's work, though, and was startled to see how much it had changed since he left. Where once it could have been dismissed as frivolous, there was now a tragedy to it that flowed from the words. Even now I can't hear exposure without being back in that damned trench at winter-time, and the public clearly felt similar, as one of the few newspapers we actually got through to the line had an extensive article praising his first collection. Despite all this, there was something about it that sat uneasily with me. Wilfred returned to the Second Manchesters in July of 1918. He was clearly much changed from his time away, and seemed to be in good enough spirits, though we talked little any more, and when he looked at me, I saw in his eyes a fear that he was quick to hide. The war was grinding towards a close at this point. There was a fatigue that could be felt everywhere. Even the enemy machine guns felt slower and more begrudging in their fire. But this charged our commanders to spur us on to more and more aggressive actions, some desperate attempt to push Germany into a surrender, I suppose, and our attacks grew to a crescendo. On the first day of October, we were ordered to storm the enemy position at Joncourt. I remember the weather that day was beautiful, a last day of sunshine before autumn pressed in. We charged with some success, as I believe the German artillery hadn't been lined up correctly, and for the first time since his return, I found myself fighting alongside Wilfred. I can say without a word of a lie that across all the war, I never saw a soldier fight with such ferocity as I saw in him that day. I hasten to add that statement is not given in admiration. The savagery I saw in him as he tore into a man with his bayonet, I'd just as soon forget it. As he charged, he howled a terrible battle cry, and just for a moment, I could have sworn that I saw him cast a shadow that was not his own. I read in the paper he won the Military Cross for that attack. It was a month later that I woke up to find him sitting next to my bed. He stared at me, not unkindly, though there was something in his eye that put me ill at ease. "Almost over now, Clarence," he said to me. I said yes, it did seem to be all coming to an end. He smiled and shook his head. He sat there quietly for some time. At one point a flare burst in the sky outside, and enough of that stark red light came through the dugout's makeshift doorway for me to see that Wilfred was crying. I knew he was listening to the Piper's tune. He asked me if I heard it, and I told him no, I didn't. And I wasn't sure I ever really had. He nodded and said he didn't know which of us was the lucky one. And neither did I. Still don't, really. Wilfred Owen died crossing the canal at Sambrawas 2 days later. There wasn't meant to be much, if any, resistance, but some of the soldiers stationed there returned fire. I found myself crouching behind him as the captain, who had been shot in the hip, was pulled to safety. As we prepared to charge, Wilfred stopped all at once and turned to me with a smile on his face. At that moment, I saw a trickle of blood start to flow from an opening hole in his forehead. I feel like I should make this clear. I have seen many people get shot. I know what it looks like and how a bullet hole appears. But here the bullet hole simply opened, like an eye, and he fell to the ground, dead. It was told to me later that it was on that day the first overtures of peace were made between the nations, and the armistice was signed almost exactly a week later. We were shipped home soon after. I believe it was not merely on that day, but at that very moment when Wilfred fell, that the peace was finally assured. No one can convince me otherwise. Did the Piper spare him before? Did it simply use him later to cast him aside? I don't know, and I try not to think about it overmuch. I have a wife now and a child on the way, but I still get nightmares sometimes. The parade for Armistice Day passed by my house last year, and I had to shut my window tight when the military band marched past. It wasn't a tune I cared to hear. Statement ends. Well, if further evidence was needed of my predecessor's disorganization, here we have it. A statement from 1922 filed among the mid-2000s. Obviously, there's not much research or further investigation to be done into a case almost 100 years old, especially when it involves so well-documented a figure as Wilfred Owen. Still, an interesting enough tale, and I feel like I recognize the name Joseph Rayner from somewhere, though for the life of me I couldn't say where. I've had the case returned to its proper location in the archives. Recording ends.
The Magnus Archives is a podcast distributed by rustyquill.com and licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike International License. Today's episode was written and performed by Jonathan Sims. It was produced and directed by Alexander J. Newell. To comment on episodes, make donations and view links, images, videos, and show notes, visit rustyquill.com. Rate and review us on iTunes, visit us on Facebook, tweet us on Twitter @TheRustyQuill, or email us at mail@rustyquill.com. Thanks for listening.